Welcome to episode 27 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is my fellow partner in crime, Anshel. So let me start with my first topic. There have been a number of announcements from Cisco related to service provider and 5G. Cisco's Partner Summit's been going on this week, and it was interesting. They shared a statistic that they've seen over $1 billion in recent bookings and a 15% increase in revenue. And this is in their mass scale infrastructure group. And when you sort of look at over the last couple of weeks, some of the announcements, one was with AT&T around helping them manage IoT, and another was with Verizon and related to mobile edge computing. Cisco is really leaning into its enterprise capabilities to really sort of drive its service provider business, and I think it's quite impressive. They have been a part of the Rakuten deployment. It's been sort of the poster child of using virtualization and agility to quickly roll out their LTE network and as well as their 5G network. So I continue to be impressed, with Cisco and their push into service provider. It's no secret that they're a leader in optical as well, supporting those transport networks. And so again, it's quite impressive. And I don't know, Anshel, if you follow Cisco very closely in this part of the world, but any thoughts?
I think it's a little too deep into your world in terms of coverage.
Right.
But I mean, the truth is that partnering with companies like AT&T and Verizon for IoT and MEC computing is super important.
Yeah.
And Cisco can't miss all of the networking opportunities that are coming with 5G and the new devices and services that are going to utilize their networking or someone's networking.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good to see that they're not only taking this seriously, but also gaining traction.
Yeah, they've supported LTE and a lot of their router devices as sort of a failover, for Wi-Fi. I was in a session at Partner Summit just today. Scott Harrell is an executive that leads a lot of the roadmap development there, and asked him straight up, hey, is this something that Cisco is really going to focus on, private cellular networking? And he said they're still evaluating things. He did mention that they're going to support their customers, based on their needs. Wi-Fi 6, there are great improvements in device support, power management, and latency and all of that good stuff. But, this private networking sector is an area that I cover. Nokia is quite heavily focused there. Nokia's route to market, obviously a service provider, and it just seems natural to me that Cisco would want to lean into private networking because they have, arguably, the largest enterprise install base on the planet. So it'll be.
I also think the way private networking is, I see it being deployed is going to be very enterprise Wi-Fi like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's right within Cisco's wheelhouse. So it feels like it should be a right fit. But I think we'll see, how that develops.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's shift to your first topic this week, and T-Mobile announced Mid-Band Rollout.
Yeah, so as you know, we've been talking about T-Mobile 600 megahertz for quite some time now, and we've been talking about, how they've been aggressively rolling out 2.5 gigahertz as well.
Mm-hmm.
T-Mobile's been claiming that they're rolling out around 1,000 2.5 gigahertz sites per month. And on Wednesday, they announced that they were lighting up another 200 cities and towns,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to the 200 that they already have lit up. By the looks of it, most of these towns and cities are suburban areas surrounding the larger metropolitan areas that Sprint was already serving. So they turned on some suburbs like Overland, which is outside of Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
They turned on some New Jersey, which is outside New York, and they turned on some Chicago. So it's a lot of even Dallas, I think. So a lot of them are kind of adjacent cities to big former Sprint markets.
Mm-hmm.
And the first initial 200 cities and towns were kind of already covered by Sprint, but have been now transitioned to T-Mobile. So it's good to see that they're actually expanding the footprint now, and that they're growing to a full count of 408 cities from 210 before. So they're more than doubling. I'm not sure if they're really quoting how many more pops they're adding by doing this. Those numbers were not quoted anywhere, but I think pops is obviously going to be the most important number in terms of actually delivering 2.5 gigahertz in a way that changes the network experience and improves bandwidth for most users.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I read the release as well, and again, they reiterated that they have the biggest position in mid-band relative to their competitors out there. That's obviously based on the Sprint acquisition and the spectrum assets that were acquired there. And it seems like they're taking full advantage of that, right? And mid-band is going to be that great balance of propagation, distance, and performance, and really complements what they're doing in the low band, and also in millimeter wave and some of those larger metro areas that you were speaking to. And it makes perfect sense when you sort of look at what they're doing with their mid-band rollout to do those adjacent suburbs to those major metro areas. They're blanketing the density of their subscriber base, basically.
And the interesting thing a lot of people don't really think about is 2.5 gigahertz. Sprint has already spent a considerable amount of time optimizing for coverage and making it work with HPUE and stuff like that for 4G.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting is Sprint did not have a 600 megahertz coverage layer that improved 2.5 gigahertz coverage, because your coverage is essentially dependent on your upload capabilities, and 2.5 does not have the propagation that 600 does. But if you aggregate 600 and 2.5 like T-Mobile's been showing, then you can actually get better coverage on 2.5, because you can use 600 as your upload carrier and 2.5 as your down, or do both as down. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with 2.5 gigahertz coverage compared to 4G, because T-Mobile is combining 600 with 2.5.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, let's move to my second topic this week. And actually, you and I were just briefed in detail just about an hour ago on this, but Ericsson rolled out their Cloud RAN portfolio. And I had some questions, that were answered when we had that session with Ericsson earlier. I'm impressed because Ericsson is providing operators another path. They were, he was pretty adamant, the gentleman that we spoke with, that this isn't going to replace, purpose-built infrastructure, but that it's going to be a complement, and it's fully, integrated into their radio portfolio, and it's going to, it's going to provide, another avenue for operators that, maybe are, wanting to roll out, discrete services, or provide that, that extra bandwidth and that extra capacity to layer this into, existing networks. And they were talking to us today about specific, vertical applications, and it struck me, it kind of reminded me of, sort of the whole, scenario around private networking, but obviously this is a discrete public, deployment. So what were your thoughts after the conversation we had today?
I will be the first one to admit I didn't quite understand initially where they were going with it, because Ericsson is such a big infrastructure provider for purpose-built infrastructure and RAN.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to understand that there's definitely new verticals and new applications where a rigid RAN doesn't make sense, because it just doesn't fit the service and usage models of what's trying to be done in those parts of the network. Yeah. So like, the Verizons, the AT&Ts, and T-Mobiles very likely do not want to have purpose-built network in new stadiums or new buildings. Sure. And they're much more likely interested in having more edge compute and something that's got, cloud native capabilities that fit what the services their customers are looking to deliver through their networks. And I feel like having a cloud RAN that's very dynamic and capable of adjusting to, what customer needs are will ultimately um, be the right approach. And I think, having more than one flavor of RAN for Ericsson is probably a good thing because, they are the leader in a lot of ways. And I
Yeah.
think that they want to make sure that they don't lose on opportunities with customers because they don't offer a cloud RAN.
Yeah, I agree. And, I like the architecture approach as well. It's microservices, it's built from the ground up, it's web scale, it's containerized. And so it'll really, it'll fit very nicely, with, people that are focused on CI/CD, and DevOps and, that sort of thing. And from an application perspective, they touched on mixed reality, right? And that's an area that you cover for the firm. And the ability to be able to, sort of fine tune that latency and that throughput I think is compelling. And the other thing that kind of came to my mind during the conversation was, Ericsson has not been bullish on Open RAN. So I think Cloud RAN is sort of where they're going to hang their hat. Certainly, Samsung and Nokia have cast themselves into the Open RAN space, and not that Ericsson won't come around over time potentially with Open RAN, but I think this is a logical step for them, and it also helps preserve their profitability in RAN. And I agree with you. They're likely the undisputed leader. They have been in RAN, and so this just sort of extends their capabilities there. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But with that, let's move to your second topic, and you've got some news to share around the DoD and a spectrum sharing announcement.
Yeah, so news literally came out earlier today that the Department of Defense is actually interested in engaging in some spectrum sharing of government spectrum that's currently dedicated 100% to the DoD,
Mhm.
and sharing it with some commercial providers like AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile to give them access to more spectrum to enable them to improve their mid-band coverage. Because realistically, this is more of a mid-band discussion more than anything because AT&T and Verizon have a considerable amount in low band, but
Yeah,
are struggling to acquire enough mid-band. And with T-Mobile's acquisition of Sprint, they have more than enough than they need.
right.
Um, so this is really an AT&T and Verizon discussion. But I think, for AT&T and Verizon to be competitive with T-Mobile, they do need to increase their spectrum holdings in mid-band, and being able to share this spectrum with operators is going to be a beneficial thing for the DoD because, these operators can, one, pay for these licenses to share spectrum, but two, can also provide services to the DoD through their partners like Northrop or whomever, and basically start creating 5G services that improve the readiness of the military to react and to communicate with itself.
Hmm.
Because a lot of military technologies in terms of communications are fairly old, but are also reliable. And I think the military would absolutely like the idea of having a redundant network that they could fall back on if there were some kind of issues. And having more partners and more diversity is interesting. But I also think that it potentially could um, create some opportunities for security vulnerabilities as well. Even though I'm
Hmm.
sure that DoD equipment, and commercial equipment probably have no cross pollination. There are still ways to leverage spectrum to crowd and create issues. So it'll be interesting to see how the DoD manages this and how they roll out this kind of spectrum sharing. It's interesting because the DoD is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in rolling out 5G networks with partners like Verizon and AT&T. So it's going to be interesting to see how this applies with what they're working with on these operators, and how these two different components of 5G work to improve commercial and military applications.
Yeah, I didn't catch it. So I'm not, very knowledgeable around the announcement.
It
I am,
was brand
yeah,
new, super
yeah,
hot.
super
Surprised.
hot. So, but I'm surprised, we've got CBRS on go, and that's repurposed naval military spectrum that goes through that, that sharing, scenario that, I'm curious why, the DoD chose to do something sort of outside of CBRS, but I'll need to dig into that a little bit further, and maybe we have a further dialogue on that. But let's move to my last topic this week, and it's around the 5G fund for rural America. So this is the FCC. The budget that's been earmarked is $9 billion. So we've talked about this before. There's been lots of discussions around dedicating funds to rural America to rip and replace Huawei gear. I think that number was a billion when it was first kind of thrown out there. I think you and I sort of laughed at that. We scoffed at that because we know what the investments are, in deploying cellular infrastructure. It's in the tens of billions of dollars. So this gets a little bit, closer to a realistic, amount of money that's going to be required. But I'm wondering, where is all that going to be spent? Is it going to be solely just focused on, ripping and replacing existing infrastructure that's already serving rural America? Is it to expand, areas that are underserved, or is it both? I would assume both, but 9 billion still seems like a small number to me. What do you think?
Well, I do think it's not enough money. It probably needs. Here's the problem. We as a country have spent, I think now hundreds of billions of dollars to have a nationwide fiber network that we do not have. So fundamentally, giving too much money to the government to roll out a program like this is problematic because we may never actually see the benefits of it.
Yeah.
That said, too little money also does not solve the problem. So there has to be a happy medium. And the problem is that I think rural connectivity is inherently an economically unsolvable problem.
It's challenging. Yeah, subscribers, right?
Yeah, there's no the economic benefits of making the investments. It takes the time to return on investment is decades. And no operator is willing to make those investments because it just doesn't work for their investors. So I think there definitely has to be a government solution to this problem that taxpayers will pay for.
Yeah.
And I think it's fine to tax. I think we should tax cities to pay for rural, right? It's just the operators, they get an absolute massive amount of profit coming out of the cities because that's where they get all of their density and all of their scale. Then they kind of just ignore the rural areas, and then the government picks up the bill. So I think that ultimately this has to be a partnership between the government and operators, and choosing the right strategy to resolve the coverage gaps and performance gaps and experience gaps that people have in rural areas. But I think it really should be focused on maximizing every dollar and improving coverage and performance to a point where people are not being left behind. And I think that's ultimately an important thing to consider. I personally visited a couple friends in a rural area recently, and shocker, they didn't know that T-Mobile was rolling out 600 megahertz in their area, and suddenly it was double the speed of what Verizon was offering in that same city. So it's doable. Admittedly, it was a town of like 25,000 people, but that's still relatively small and considered rural at this point. And I think there are avenues to making this possible, but I have a feeling that's mostly going to exist in the low and mid band, and millimeter wave is pretty much a non-starter except for enabling for infrastructure, which we've been discussing in previous podcasts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's going to need to be some sort of subsidy It probably will come in the form of, some sort of, surcharge or some sort of, tax to your point. But I also think there are companies that stand to benefit tremendously from building out connectivity in rural America, with respect to the application of ag tech. John Deere, they build those huge combines and tractors and all of that. I mean, I think it can be a hybrid model where, there has to be some subsidy there, but getting these large, agricultural, companies involved, and then getting creative around, like how to go figure that all out, and how to, you know, raise that additional, funding. And because, the benefit in ag tech is going to improve crop yields, it's going to improve ranching operations, it's going to improve hatcheries, and you name it, right?
Market.
So,
It's
yeah,
gonna,
so
crop spoiling, all these. I mean, think about how much loss we have due just to crop spoilage. So it's like
right,
there's huge components to, just having data in real time. I also think a satellite is gonna be a big component of this as well.
yeah,
You know,
I agree.
the Starlink is a big component of that. There's gonna be other services. I think marrying 5G with satellites is gonna be a big component of improving rural coverage.
Yeah, I've been looking at that, and I think, yeah, it'll be the low orbit, and right now the latency is still a challenge there. But I agree. I think that technology is going to improve over time. You've got, you mentioned Starlink. You've got SpaceX. You had OneWeb. Now Hughes bought OneWeb.
CS.
Yeah, they're trying to revive that. So it may take a few years, but I think definitely satellite is going to become a big factor there. So, well, let's move to your last topic, and you want to talk about the NBA and their potential deployment of 5G.
Yeah, so as you all know, NBA season just ended. Lakers won, woohoo! But the reality is that sorry, I'm a Lakers fan. I don't have anybody in San Diego. Um, but the thing is that most of the season was spent in the bubble, right? So
Yeah,
what ended up happening is that um, nobody got to see the games at all, and everything was remotely operated and remotely watched. And now CNBC kind of wrote up an article talking to the NBA and how they've been partnering with companies like Facebook to deliver VR experiences that are courtside using 5G to enable high quality courtside experiences for people who can't be there. And this is something that they've honestly been working on for years. They had a partnership with NextVR. Now NextVR is part of Apple. So that's not happening anymore. They kind of NextVR kind of shut down on its own, but
hmm
Apple acquired them, so that's not happening anymore. But basically, Facebook has a new VR headset that's out now, and it's very good. It's very high resolution, but there needs to be more content for it. So Facebook
yeah,
has been working with NBA to deliver these sideline rail cams that basically follow the players as they go down court. And since there's no spectators, there's no issues with having to utilize the best seats in the house. So
hmm
the season doesn't start till January, so there's still some time to figure out how they're going to do this and how they're going to deploy this. But 5G is going to be a big component of enabling that. And since nobody really knows, what the future holds in January, I
hmm
have a feeling that they'll most likely probably start the season in a bubble, especially as a lot of COVID-19 cases start to rise now. I don't see that things will probably get any better anytime soon. So most likely they're going to start again in a bubble, and they're going to want people to watch, regardless. And the best way to watch will most likely be in VR. So
hmm
it's going to be very interesting to see how that works out. There are going to be a lot of people with these headsets, and it might actually be the killer app for this headset because people love watching live sports. It's a great escape from everything that's going on around us.
yeah.
I personally have enjoyed watching the MLB season as well as the NBA season. So I think it's going to be an interesting application, and I think if the partnership goes smoothly, it'll only continue to expand.
Yeah, and I think yeah, that should expand into other major sports as well. Yeah, so it's exciting stuff. Well, another great podcast this week. Take us home, Anshel.
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us with insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you guys have a great weekend, and please tune again next time.